and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Benway. And today we're going to be talking about two novels that we're going to be comparing and contrasting. George Orwell's 1984 and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And these two novels are the preeminent dystopian future kind of novels. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the things that they predicted have come true, even as their visions of the future are radically different. And so we're going to talk about them. First of all, let me welcome my co-host, Dr. Benway. Dr. Benway, how's it going?
Not too bad. Good start to the morning.
Good. I'm so glad. And so anyway, when did you read these two novels? And what are your thoughts on it? Just kick it off and just tell us all you know about them.
Well, I can't remember exactly when I had first read 1984. I'm sure it was in high school. As per usual, it's one of those books that has a reputation which precedes it. And I think more people tend to talk about it having not read it as opposed to having read it and then have a response to it. And I read Brave New World much later. Probably it would have been around college age. And, you know, what's interesting about this is this conversation I feel that other people have had, you know, the idea is, who's more accurate or whatnot. I think, you know, as you're going to find out, I think both in their own ways are accurate. But what's interesting is the difference of their dystopias and what the source of it is. If you really look at 1984, it's just it's clearly a depiction of an objective dystopia. There's no way anybody who lives in that society would confuse it for anything other than the tyranny that it is.
Yeah.
What's interesting about Brave New World is that it's a dystopia of utopia. Namely, it's in theory, everything that Huxley is describing is within the context of the people who live in that society, an achieved society. Everything's ordered, structured, problems and bad feelings satiated and whatnot. But nevertheless, it's a fucking disaster at the end of the day. It's a disaster of the spirit. And in my mind, as I look forward to say, well, who kind of hit it right? It's the best way I can kind of describe the world we live in is that Huxley got the details right, but it was Orwell who got the crudeness of it. Like it's like all of the details that Huxley wrote down in terms of how the society is operating seem to have come true, but Orwell got the crudeness of like, it's the sentiment of your face being stepped on by a boot in one way, shape, or form. Yeah, that's the tone that I feel we're heading towards. So I think they both got different pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah. I think that this is my feeling. First of all, I read 1984 like in high school, and Brave New World just now recently. Okay, and so my view of one is colored by my memory, and the other is, I'm reading it now as an adult. And here's the thing that strikes me about 1984, that in a weird way, like geopolitically, it's sort of accurate. But like in terms of vibe, I feel that Brave New World is more in tune insofar as like the vibe, the life of the coasts, especially of the educated coasts in America. There's something, how could I put it? Yeah, like 1984 is much more jackboots marching on the street, stomping on people's faces. Yes. And that would, in a weird way, it's a bit like the online world. But Brave New World captures like a vibe that I found very appealing.
Brave New World is clearly it's funny to say this, both, I think Brave New World is actually the older book of the two, but it feels much more contemporary in what it's going after. And like, because, and here's the, what's interesting to me is you could see the two different focuses of the authors. And I think it relates to why one feels more of its time than the other. If you really look at George Orwell is a socialist and a materialist at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And yes, he's certainly going to talk about man's spirit, but he was thinking about Britain in the aftermath of World War II. He had reflected on the life events that he had lived and had experienced at that point, and was making a message saying, "Hey, look on the road that you find yourself, and I'm sure you're not going to be happy of where it's going to go." And it had that kind of technical, sort of like near-term goal to it. Whereas if you really look at Aldous Huxley, and he was like this to the day he died, which ironically enough was the same day Jack Kennedy was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
He was very much a man interested in the spiritual aspects of life, but also the sort of psychological aspects of the society writ large. And if you really look at what his concern of Brave New World was, it was what was going to happen to the spirit of man in this new modern commercialized world. And so you get a sense from him that it wasn't just for the sake of, trying to convince you to take one sort of policy route versus another, as much as where your soul's going to end up. And when you're kind of disassociated to a certain extent from this specific historical context, you kind of allow yourself the freedom to, funny enough, survive longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think that's part of the contemporary feel to it all. Not to mention just the details that he kind of fundamentally got right are there. And I think the biggest thing he got right was the degree to which this society was going to emphasize, quote unquote, individuality and individual based structuring.
Mm-hmm.
At the expense of the family unit.
Yeah.
And he carried out, well, what would that mean? And I think that's why he got the details of at least Western society down pat.
Yeah, because it's really interesting. I think that's the crux of the matter. Aldous Huxley seemed to me to understand where individuality would go, whereas George Orwell viewed that individuality would be stamped out. It's weird because George Orwell saw individuality as being stamped out by the state, but Aldous Huxley saw it more clearly that individuality would be co-opted by the people in power as the Pied Piper, the song that would be played to lull the masses, the illusion of individuality, which I think is a much more interesting idea. Now, the funny thing is that, the history of Brave New World is, of course, that Aldous Huxley, before Brave New World, was a satirist. He was actually a light writer, okay? I mean, his novels were basically parodies and satires. And he deliberately chose to write a satire on H.G. Wells, who had written, I'm looking at it now, A Modern Utopia and Men Like Gods, neither of which I've read. I don't know if you have. Have you?
No.
Okay. So anyway, the point of Huxley was that he was making fun of H.G. Wells, but he got caught up in his own ideas. He started seeing the possibility, the reality of his ideas. And Brave New World, because I was reading it, right? And it sort of like swerves because I can always feel glimmers of humor in it. And yet at the same time, you sort of like the bright shining eyes of somebody who's come across a new landscape that he hadn't anticipated. Okay? That's the vibe I get from Brave New World. Whereas 1984, it's just grim. Because H.G. Wells knew where he was going. Excuse me, H.G. Wells. I mean, George Orwell knew where he was going. And he was just going to present a nightmare for you. And he did, And it's depressing. But, that's the way it is,
There's a couple of biographical details of Huxley that I think are pertinent to kind of his outlook versus Orwell's here. One, I think it's important to note to some extent that Huxley was a member of as aristocratic a family when it came to the British literary world, like Matthew Arnold. He was from the Arnold and the Huxley family.
Yeah.
So Matthew Arnold, the great critic, and the Huxleys, who have, historically were very big, kind of, I guess, liberal-minded authors, if you will. So that carries with him the weight of the history of ideas that's kind of like literally written into his DNA almost. And that kind of somewhat academic, but also somewhat, long-term view on the nature of, human beings over time permeates his writing much more so than Orwell. Orwell was ultimately like a middle-class kind of guy,
Yeah.
and was, like I said, very prone to materialism and socialism.
Yeah.
What was also interesting is the two men actually have a tight connection. Aldous Huxley was George Orwell's teacher in Orwell never went to university, but at college at Eton. Aldous Huxley was, I think, his French teacher or his literary teacher. I forget which one. And he remembers that the kids would always just make fun of Aldous Huxley because he was very kind of nearsighted, very overly studious, and he was just the source of easy criticism. And Orwell, I think, regretted it, but I'm pretty sure he actually participated in it when he was a kid. And so you get in some sense, you get the life of the introvert, of which Huxley was a man of kind of intellectual, ideas and almost not self-absorption, but at least life of the mind is this big guy. And Orwell, again, related to the materialism, Orwell was the kind of guy who got bored easily and had to do things. So when he didn't go to university, he went to Burma and was a police officer essentially in the British Empire, and saw firsthand what empire actually meant in terms of what the violence you had to do to keep it going. Then he got bored with that and started paying attention to the working conditions of the coal miners, saw that wasn't a fun thing. Wound up going to the Spanish Civil War and got disillusioned with all elements of that war. And you got a guy who's like, there's just things that are happening. I got to write them down. And even though, being in and of the world certainly can keep you energized, I felt like he never really paused in such a way to think of, like, just spiritually, intellectually, where are we kind of going? It's more like, I got to write down all of these facts. I'm a journalist. He really was a journalist at the end of the day, and 84 really feels just like a transmuted form of that.
Mm-hmm. What about Animal Farm?
Same thing. Animal Farm was a way of trying to articulate the inner workings of the Soviet Union at a time when people weren't really prepared to talk about it directly.
No, about them. I find George Orwell grimmer. He was accurate but grimmer. Whereas Aldous Huxley, I guess, as a novel, I prefer Brave New World. It just feels it's certainly better written, and it just feels more welcoming somehow. Okay, creepy and creepier. Okay, maybe it's because the kind of materialist approach that Orwell imbued, that's been parodied to death and just used in all kinds of stuff, from Terry Gilliam pictures in like Brazil and the Macintosh 1984 commercial, right? That kind of and Pink Floyd's The Wall, right? You get this vibe that it's not as interesting because it's not as seductive. It's more easy to parody, and you can only parody things that are obviously outside of yourself. Okay. Whereas Brave New World is harder to parody. Okay. And I'm not surprised that Brave New World has not been, they've turned it into a movie. I don't think it was a memorable movie, or at least I don't remember ever seeing it. You?
I did see it. It came across like a sort of like a TV movie of the late 90s. I think, what's his face? Leonard Nimoy was in it. A few, like Peter Gallagher, a few others. It wasn't particularly memorable, but in part, I just don't think it's one of those books that lends itself very well to like a cinematic depiction, in part because, like I said, it's not operating under like action as much. Yeah. Whereas 84 absolutely is, and actually the 1984 version of 1984 is actually a pretty damn good movie, because it's, like I said, it's a very action oriented piece. But I think part of the reason Orwell's 1984 feels so memorable is just it's obviously a brutalist story. It's meant to be a punch in the gut. Yeah. And whatnot. Like I said, they're both operating, I guess, as warnings to a certain extent. But Orwell, I'm pretty sure Orwell in his own mind thought he was trying to raise the lantern on saying, like, preparing someone for something. I suspect Aldous Huxley recognized that the path to the Brave New World was mostly inevitable at this point, and I don't think he was in a position to really stop it. I think if you really look at if you look at any of his books that are called to like get people to do something, they're very personal level, consciousness expanding kind of stuff. So The Doors of Perception,
Yeah.
which recounts it was about basically his taking of LSD
Well,
and other various other things.
yeah. The thing about Huxley about Brave New World is that it's more interesting to me because um, there is a clear sense at the beginning, especially of Brave New World, that this is kind of like a joke, a goof. Okay. If you don't actually know that it's parodying H.G. Wells, you get that sort of like between the lines that it's a goof. But then it sort of like turns, because I think that what happened was that Huxley realized that this is all possible, that what he was writing was possible, and that energized him. And so in the writing, there's like a pickup. The pace picks up. It feels like energized in weird ways, like a stop and start kind of thing. Because sometimes he seems to be like making fun of H.G. Wells, and then he's sort of like, whoa, this can happen. This will happen, and he's like surprised by it. Whereas Orwell, it's like a grim slog. Okay. I mean, yeah, like some of it is great. I mean, like, and some of the thing is really fucking prescient. Like when the TV talks to Winston Smith, come on, Winston, you're not exercising enough, right? I mean, that was great shit. And that's like eerily possible nowadays with smart TVs, right? And we don't even think about it. We don't even mention the fact, but it's perfectly possible that could happen. That, we wind up doing exercise in front of the TV and the TV starts berating us, right? Now, how creepy would that be? Okay, and to think that might happen, I mean, think about it. I can easily picture, and it might even be happening right now, that there's some personal trainer somewhere who gets all of his clients on Skype, and he has 20 clients on Skype, and he sees them all through his smart TV, and he's doing the thing, and he talks to them individually through the smart TVs, and each of them pays him $5 an hour instead of $100 an hour as the case would be for a regular personal trainer, and yeah, you could see that happening, okay, but there's a certain grimness and there's an evilness to the government. There's an evilness to the government that Aldous Huxley knows would not have existed, because it wouldn't have been from a place of evil, but a place of trying to do good. I think that's the thing. George Orwell thought that there were good people and bad people. He did not seem morally sophisticated. That's my feeling about him. Whereas Aldous Huxley did. He understood that the evil people were going to be doing evil out of good motivations, or their perceptions of doing having good motivations. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think George Orwell probably he understood a conception of the totalitarian state in which the state knows it's acting in such a way, and he captures, I think, accurately how a mind using brute force tactics would function, and I think that's when he gets interesting and he actually gets most prescient. So not just in terms of the famous scene in 1984 where they're abusing Winston Smith with the how many lights do you see? It's 4 lights, slap him. It's like, no, it's 5 lights. Eventually he says 5 lights, and they slap him again. It says, no, it's not just enough to say 5 lights. You have to believe it. That mentality is certainly very interesting to me, and also the 2 minutes, 5 minutes of hate, which is just more prescient than anything he wrote in that book. But yes, it's a brute force tactic. A regime which knows that people aren't going to like it and operates regardless. And I think what's wrong about that is it was accurate for a time. It was accurate in depicting of how the communist states of the Soviet Union operated, but ultimately outside of a few pockets of the world, it doesn't continue.
Yeah.
Aldous Huxley captured, what the liberal democracies sort of are becoming, which was, you're exactly right. We're trying to alleviate problems here. We're trying to do things that are kind of good for you, or not even necessarily quote unquote good for you, like a good daddy state, as much as people just exhibiting the values that they were already articulating. I think one of the we should probably hit some of the details that he kind of came up with the society that I think are very interesting. I think the biggest thing to me is when you look at how the people are literally engineered. in Brave New World. You don't have people being birthed through families and, with a chance of chaos and all of that. Citizens are engineered through artificial wombs, and based on how under what conditions you were born, you enter in some sense a caste system. This the alphas, the betas, the gammas, and the deltas, and you and based on that, we decide what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, and it isn't in a matter of saying like, oh, these ridiculous, peasants are just awful people. It's like, oh no, you just have a job to do. Deltas have their job to do. Alphas have their thing, and they condition people to, to recognize that. It's like, hey, I'm a delta, and I'm happy being a delta because alphas have such hard thinking to do, and it's kind of rough. I wouldn't want that job. And it's like I said, it's operating under the notions of an achieved society. Now, I don't think we've fully engineered ourselves to do that, but the idea that the family is a problem and that an individual is the locus of everything, and then that's going to decide, your place, that's absolutely kind of how we think.
Yeah.
And the techniques that we use to manage all of this, like, high emphasis on entertainment as a distraction, the use of drugs like soma just to induce a state of just artificial bliss or artificial ignorance, depending on that's us to a fucking T.
Yeah. Yeah. What they both get kind of wrong is how the society would view things as maladies that have to be fixed. Because it doesn't seem as if they view things as maladies. You see? Because, like, okay, we have disorders. We have anxiety disorder. We have bipolar disorder. We have this disorder, that disorder, sex addiction, all the rest of it. We have disorders that have to be fixed. And I don't see how they didn't address that, did they? I wish they had.
I think soma kind of does. I mean, if you look at kind of
or
how,
the one drug that does it all kind of thing.
Yeah, if you look at how it's articulated in the book, and admittedly I'm going on this from memory, so apologies if I get the exact details wrong, but their idea is that, like, look, we want to live in a pain-free society.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the idea of wanting to be in a pain-free society, yeah, it's because I'm thinking that, sort of like myopically, I'm thinking that today we have multiple drugs. But yeah, it's ultimately one drug, the one pill. It's soma. Yeah, it feels more real. And I find it incredible that in 1931, when this novel was, I forget when it was written, but it was published in 31. Let me just check real quick. I'm amazed. Yeah, he wrote it and published it he published it in 32. He wrote it in 31. I'm amazed by how prescient it is in the vibe, Like, what I find interesting is the sexual precociousness and profligacy of the characters, as sex as an entertainment, which is exactly what we're living with today, which I think is catastrophic. Okay, and it's causing so many problems. It's
what's interesting. Also, I think, in some sense, like I said, Brave New World got lucky in terms of the fact that liberal democracies stuck around longer than the communists did. Both Orwell and Huxley are clearly, in my mind, were responding to something they experienced. Orwell, it was the experience of the Civil War and dealing with communists. For Huxley, and I'll bring this back to the book that you and I are having such trouble fucking finishing. If you look at the waves of the Attention Merchants book, that wave of advertising and consumerism that you got in the 20s, Aldous Huxley, I think, just osmotically understood the crux of the issue that were coming out of that, like the mass consumerization and the building of desires and the human spirit as a result of marketing shit to you. I think that it's hard for me to not see Brave New World as just fundamentally absorbing that and trying to say, okay, let's take this to the sort of organizational level, because at the same time, because this was what was weirdly happening, and I think you get a sense why Aldous Huxley really got into spiritualism and drug taking as a result. In the 20s, you really started getting this whole notion of like the science of sociology or the science of marketing, what have you. And in addition to just, we can create desires in people, you also had this idea that the human body was something that could be engineered, not just in terms of building the type of person you want, but like you could use techniques to manage how a person operates and how they think.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole notion of like tailorization comes
Mm-hmm.
up. That's the idea. Like you could literally, the way you set up an assembly line can dictate how a person is going to function in their job. They're like a cog in the wheel. In fact, when you read the book of Brave New World, like the sort of godlike figure over everybody, it's not like Marx or any other kind of like notable totalitarian politician. The two guys that stand out are Henry Ford and Sigmund Freud. They're referred to as our Ford, our Lord Ford, or our Lord Freud, because the two thinking of those men, the structuring of the economy in an assembly line fashion and the structuring of the unconscious mind really were the two pillars of how society was being constructed in the Western civilization at that time. And he grokked it. More so than Orwell did. Orwell did not get how these two guys were really going to be the engines of a real nefarious human engineering shit. It wasn't just going to be the brute force of, armies coming in and punching people with the rifle butt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's weird because 1984 came out famously in 1948, and full 16 years after Brave New World had come out. It's kind of surprising, rather surprising that there would be that he wouldn't have read. I mean, he must have read Aldous Huxley for sure, right? But he didn't pick up on that, which is kind of interesting. Or perhaps it was his point,
Yeah, and I think and I want to try to be fair to Orwell, because I guess it's not fair to kind of read back on things that happened after he died. Like at the time, absolutely, the worries of 1984, I could easily justify them, right? I mean, you not only were you seeing the Stalinist Soviet Empire in full force, and the Maoist China well on the coming horizon, but even the structures and the apparatuses of the British state in particular, were prepared for really top-down management of everything in a very sort of aggressive fashion. So it's I get why he thought it was going to be brutal, because the world he lived in at the time was a fucking brutal mess. Let's not forget, Americans love to think about World War II as the shining moment where we preserved democracy. But if you lived in Europe, the whole fucking landscape was ripped apart, and it was a fucking disaster.
Yeah.
And it's easy to see how one would think that the world was going to be brutal at that point on. And the 20th century was fucking brutal in the years that followed. So I can totally want to give credence to George Orwell for getting that was the bugaboo of the time. I think Huxley just in a weird way was kind of more specific and broad at the same time. He knew just psychologically what the success of liberalism would mean. Maybe I'm going off on
no.
a rant.
I agree. Yeah, and I agree that both of them are sort of like creatures of their times. Perhaps it would be fair to say that in 1931, Aldous Huxley foresaw more clearly how the liberal democracies would evolve than George Orwell could right after the Second World War.
Yeah, no, I think so. Right. I mean, because let's also keep in mind, George Orwell was so locked into the socialist argument, right? The socialist transformation, the revolutionary vision. I think another way of kind of maybe describing it in language similar to us, Aldous Huxley was living in the world of the normies and, the people who go to business and do their shit and buy stuff and are marketed to, that was kind of his milieu. So that's what he's responding to. Orwell was the fucking, shit posters on Twitter and in the social media who are at that sort of culture war battle, and they're well removed from enough of the mainstream to the point where like he has very specific attention being paid to the quote unquote vanguard of what's going to change, the political culture. So he wasn't. I just get a feeling like sometimes he wasn't really situated as well as Huxley was to kind of get the details that were happening on the ground of liberal democracy. He was really watching the ground of the revolutionary groups, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But I think that basically it devolves back to your original point that Orwell, Huxley was a man of letters, and Orwell was a journalist, and Orwell wrote a novel as a journalist, and it was very effective and very brutal, but it did not have the nuance or the artistic interest that Brave New World had. That seems because I find Brave New World much more evocative and just much more prescient as to how we're living today. Because the life that we're living today, quite frankly, I'm not living in the United States, and I haven't lived in the United States for close to 2 decades. But I feel that from what I gather from the people who have told me privately and from comments and from the news source, it seems that the people are more alone than ever. People are more disembodied, not disembodied. They're separated, atomized, more atomized than ever before, and that atomization is so destructive, and it can only be palliated by sex, drugs, entertainments, smartphones, things that distract, things that give a rush of pleasure, of like the endorphin hit. But there's nothing long-lasting. And even when people try to go after the long-lasting things, it's almost as if they're so perverted that even as they try, they're failing because they're dissatisfied with the traditional. They're dissatisfied with something more organic, more complete, more familial. Am I talking out of my ass, or does this seem to be the truth?
Well, there's one of the, I think, the amazing parts of Brave New World in the book that I really appreciate is, so you have this ostracized individual in the story who just can't fit in the society, and he's trying to find some construct to his need for, like I said, spiritual, moral, emotional fulfillment, awakening, awareness, whatever. And he's getting it through Shakespeare. Now, a lot of people would, and Huxley certainly was of a man who would have understood the fundamental value of Shakespeare. When it comes time to members of this society encountering Shakespeare, and you think he'd want to say, hey, this is the real answer. They can't even comprehend Shakespeare, right? It's completely alien to their fundamental values. They don't even have a frame of reference to get what Shakespeare's talking about. And what kind of struck me with his writing, and I think kind of where you were going, is the society in sort of near-term satiating the problems and the anxieties people have in a sort of, hey, you're stressed, take this pill. You have restless leg syndrome, take this pill. It fundamentally denatured the human mind to such a degree that it almost is unsalvageable in some way.
Yeah.
I think, and I always forget if I'm imposing this onto Brave New World or if it actually was in the book. You got the sense that they don't really need to ban any books that contradict the society because nobody is in a position to read them anyway. No one would read them if you allowed them to,
and no one would care. That's the horrifying part. No one would care because, see, in Brave New World, people are existing but not living. In Orwell's novel, they are living under grotesque conditions, but they're living. Okay. But in Brave New World, the contraband, no one would care. In Orwell's 1984, there would be people who do care. I mean, think of another dystopian novel like Fahrenheit 451, which I actually think is, well, I'm in love with the story of how Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451, right? The whole notion, I don't know if you heard it, right? didn't have money for a typewriter, so he rented a typewriter at UCLA. And he would go there, and it was like 10 cents an hour that he would get to use the typewriter. And so he estimated that it took him like something like $12.20 or something to write the whole novel. That's what it cost him to write it. I forget what the number was, if it was 10 cents an hour or something like that. But the notion that he had to pay, a dime or a quarter or whatever it was to use the typewriter to write a masterpiece, right? Another dystopian masterpiece. And how could I put this? In Brave New World, it's. I think that's the thing that it captures so well, that the characters are existing but not living. They have no purpose. They're just bumbling atoms that are in it only for their own pleasure, and they will exist and then die. They will hatch and then, just be gone, and just, cleaned up, and the dustbin will come along to collect the ashes, and they'll be tossed away, right? Whereas at least in 1984, the people were living. It was a society under pressure. I mean, Winston Smith knew that.
Well, here's what's incredible to me, and this is why Brave New World is, in some sense, the more tragic book. In 1984, it's like I said, top-down brutalism. People are living under denatured conditions, but the possibility of love is there, even if it failed in the course of the novel. Winston and Julia falling in love is a mechanism that the state realizes can happen and needs to stop it.
Right.
Brave New World, there is no love.
There's no love.
Possible.
No. There's,
and it sounds so trite and like, oh, let's hug me, squeeze me, feel me. But there's sometimes hug me, squeeze me is necessary. That love. I mean, love, and I mean love in the broadest sense, like the manifestation of the spirit of man, the will of God, whatever you want. That cannot happen anymore in Brave New World because it was engineered out.
Yeah.
The only love that is to be felt, and I use it in the biggest scare quotes possible, is sexual gratification.
Yeah, which is not love, of course. Yeah, it's a horrifying it's a horrifying reality. That's why I find Brave New World just a better novel, and I think it's more prescient. It just seems. I think that's what terrifies me the most of Brave New World. That notion that you're just existing, and you're just a sensory organ that is experiencing, pleasure signals and trying to avoid pain signals. Because that's just a horrifying way to live. But that's the way we live today. That's exactly how we live today. We try to avoid pain at all costs. We try to avoid getting our fifis hurt. And the whole point of life is to get your fifis hurt and that friction of life, because that's how you grow. You cannot grow and develop without coming into contact with an obstacle, right? I don't see how you can.
When we were comparing these books, it reminded me of there was an exchange I remember seeing, not live. I mean, I saw it on YouTube. But Janusz Korwin-Mikke, the Polish MEP, the one who's Sargon refers to as the wokest MEP in Europe.
Yeah,
he had an exchange on like a Polish television show with like some sort of liberalish kind of guy who was saying, like the need for the welfare state, and we should have basic incomes, this, that, and the other. And Mika just scoffed at him. He says, "This is the most despicable kind of," I'm paraphrasing, "the most despicable kind of living one can imagine." He says, "Even in the communist period, they say there is no reward without risk.
Yeah.
And yet you guys choose to have everything protected. You live a life as bad, if not worse, than the little tubers that live on the bottom of the ocean, just consumed and filling their faces and nothing else." He fundamentally detested that. And it's amazing to me that it kind of reflects in the books too. Even in Orwell's dystopian 1984, there is still humans functioning as humans and willing to risk things
right
for the sake of their beliefs. Huxley just saw a world of pure denatured, organisms. Like there was, I mean, that's the tragedy of Brave New World in a way. It's Brave New World postulates a world where the species of Homo sapien exists, but the human spirit does not.
Yes. Yes. Exceptionally well put. Yes, exactly right. Because it's so funny because he was making fun of H.G. Wells' Utopia, his utopian novels. He was making fun of them. And at some point he said, okay, mofo, you want to talk about utopia? Let's talk about utopia as it would actually be. And then he started realizing this is us. Okay? The utopia that H.G. Wells was positing was just a stupid fairy story, right? But the negative of that, the parody of that utopia was the reality that they would be living, that it would feel like utopia, but be a kind of hell because the soul of man would be dead. And that's it, and I think that's why there's that. I think that Aldous Huxley must have realized at the time that he was getting incredibly lucky to be writing such a book, that he'd hit on something that was going to be so prescient and so true about the society that we're living in the democracies, in the liberal democracies that he was living in at the time. Because I mean, in 1931, England was basically, it's basically Gosford Park, It was like this stylish and very fun kind of liberal democracy where everything seemed to be fine and there was no war and everything was going fine, and we're living this great life. And so what's the problem? That's what England in 1931 was like, okay? Oh yeah, we have this little, little downturn in the economy, but other than that, we're fine. And he saw that it would lead inevitably to the end of the soul. And I would venture to say that the society we're living in today has no soul. It sort of like foments that by way of just encouraging everybody to buy and to go into debt and to become debt slaves and just keep on working for the machine. It's kind of fucking horrifying if you ask me.
Here's I think another factor at play in these two novels and why Huxley saw something that Orwell didn't. Orwell is often rightly said, one of the things about my life is I had a power of facing unpleasant realities and just acknowledging what they were. In other words, Orwell was quick to say that imperialism is going to create a disastrous problem. In his mind, both Stalinist Marxism and Hitlerian fascism were other examples of things that you would face. But one thing he couldn't face, and I think you could tell based on what he was worried about versus others, was the decline of the soul and the spiritual capabilities of man. Aldous Huxley, whether he wasn't a man of organized religion, was a religious thinker in many very strong ways. That mystical, almost metaphysical view of the world allowed Huxley to write Brave New World in a way that Orwell never could. Orwell was a materialist.
Oh, yeah, but I know why. I know why. Okay? Because Orwell didn't have much of a sense of humor, and Huxley did. Think of the careers that they had, right? In terms of their writing. One was a journalist, the other was a satirist. And what's a satirist? He's somebody who makes fun of stuff. He laughs at stuff, right? And so the very fact that he laughs at stuff allows him to see the foibles of people and to recognize when they're being foolish and when their actions are the wrong actions but noble, okay? Whereas somebody who is humorless cannot see that, cannot see the issue of motivation, okay? And so that's why Huxley's novels are so much more humane, or at least this novel. I haven't really read other Huxley stuff, right?
Well, religion is a very common theme in his books, and to the point where I have to impose. I don't have to, but I do impose it on Brave New World as a result. So, The Devils of Loudon, which became Ken Russell's The Devils, it's based on that Aldous Huxley book, was about the mass religious possession event in France, and the church responded to that. Another essay he wrote called The Grey Eminence was about not just Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu, as everybody knows, was the Cardinal of France, but was also effectively the ruler of France during the heat the 40 years war, the Catholics versus the Protestants in Germany. And the big thing people remember was he put Catholic France allied to the Protestants in Germany for political reasons, very Machiavellian.
Yeah.
Well, there was a character, I forgot the man's name, unfortunately, who was a monk in the church who was an advisor to Richelieu, who was a pure mystic in some regards, but was just, was giving, spiritual causal reasons to back up what Richelieu was doing. And as a Catholic mystic monk, basically saying that it's right for the Catholic cardinal ruler of France to fight a war on behalf of Protestants.
Against Catholics.
Against Catholics. And basically, Huxley talked about the psychological twists and turns that are going on in such a Father Joseph, is I think what was the man's name, or I think was the moniker. And anyway, this is a man who constantly in his books is thinking about the religious and spiritual realm of man's thinking. Right. So it's just hard for me to not impose that now on Brave New World, especially when you see what the real source of the satire was. I mean, the source of the satire was all of the material techniques that you're going to manage to scratch the itch that religion, by its very nature, is designed to scratch. When you get rid of the religious and the spiritual realm of man, how are you going to scratch that itch? And as a result of those techniques, what are you doing to man? Stunned silence.
Yeah, I'm thinking over what you're saying, and I don't know where to take it from there, to tell you the truth. Because I mean it's a lot to chew on, I guess. I'm stunned silence. What do you think of the characters?
And it's funny because
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No. I'd rather. I was going to go where you're going to go. The characters.
Yeah. What do you think of the characters?
It's funny. I'll give this to George Orwell. I feel I remember Winston Smith and Julia and the various members of the party more than I do a lot of the characters in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is funny because I still think Brave New World's objectively the more interesting book, but from the basic mechanics of like a good book needs characters and whatnot, I'll grant it. 1984 just produced more obviously compelling characters. I think 84, I'm sorry, not 84, Brave New World, much more the setting and the details and the backdrop kind of carries it to me. Not to say I don't remember anything. I mean, it's like Mustafa Mond is an interesting character to me, and some of the main protagonists that are moving the story.
Yeah,
I remember them more as to like what they represent than who they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, because that's an interesting thing. I think it's an issue again of the fact of being a reporter. That I get the sense that Orwell was basing his characters on people he actually knew, whereas Huxley was like writing characters. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's a different kind of approach, and so lots of writers, especially men of letters, they don't actually know that many people. Okay, because if you're a real man of letters, your social circle tends to be relatively small, and whereas a reporter would be out there with people, and he'd meet a lot of people. Orwell would, especially with the kind of career that he had. Everything from being a policeman, which is just daily meeting strangers all the time and having to deal with their problems and on the spot, right? And quickly sizing up people and figuring out what's what and who's to blame and who's telling the truth and who's lying. That kind of occupation, right? Think of the impact it would have had on him in terms of being able to create character, I think that, oddly enough, though Huxley is a more accomplished writer, Orwell wrote better characters, which is bizarre if you think about it, but makes sense if you look at it biographically, or at least that's my contention.
Yeah, and there's a degree to which, and this is also, I think, related to their personality. I got the sense that even though Orwell clearly has political motivations here, like I get the sense that 1984 was a book made for, mass consumption and like sort of like it's a page turner and it's meant to be. It has action set pieces. It goes from point A to point Z and whatnot. It's operating, God forgive me for saying this. Sorry, George, but it's operating in the best possible way that pulp books do.
Yeah, he was trying to make money.
Yeah, exactly. And Brave New World is a literary exercise.
Yeah. It's very clear that Huxley wasn't particularly concerned about sales of his books. I mean, he was like any writer would be, but Orwell wanted to make money. He wanted to make a pulpy book. He wanted to make a book that would, rack up the sales. He didn't want any kind of literary respectability. I don't think that Orwell, I don't actually know this because I've actually never read a full-on biography of Orwell, but I don't think that he particularly cared about having any kind of literary reputation.
Well, what's interesting is he wrote so much in his life. He was a big literary critic, funny enough. He would, like professionally, like people just throw books at him and he would comment on it.
No, he'd review them. He got £10 per review. Yeah,
exactly. And he's certainly a guy who has, his mind in the literary world. But I think if you're just looking at what he produced, I don't think you can really point to it and say, yeah, this is a guy who is looking to write like James Joyce, looking to be remembered as the great novelist. I think, funny enough, the guy who, and this is no shock that I'm going to say this, the writer contemporary who feels most like Orwell is Christopher Hitchens in that regard, which was Hitchens would write about literary matters and have very sophisticated literary taste. But at the end of the day, the sort of like out and about amongst the people, journalism, I got to get it out of my system. Hitchens and Orwell are just eye to eye on that. And I think neither of them really operated in a level that they would ever do like the great, I'll be remembered as this great novelist of, of the tradition. So it's just not how they were hardwired.
Yeah, it's interesting about Christopher Hitchens because Orwell was his hero, but I don't see it in Christopher Hitchens. He didn't hold a candle to Orwell, which I find kind of sad. I mean, there are a lot of people who have tried to be the Orwell of their time. Christopher Hitchens is the most famous one. But who else has tried to be that?
That's tough. I mean, admittedly, not others come to mind. I have to. No, I'm sorry to confess that.
Yeah. No, but others have, because nobody tries to be Aldous Huxley. I mean, have you ever heard of somebody who says, "Yeah, Aldous Huxley is my hero"? No, which is kind of weird. I mean, the closest I would think of somebody who would be, up for being that would be like Updike, maybe. Kind of like that humorous writer. God, I'm thinking of Updike now as we're talking about Huxley and his reputation, right? And Harold Bloom's Harold Bloom, right? The Yale critic, right?
Yeah.
He really was right that Updike was a second or third rate novelist with a first rate talent, because he didn't write anything even remotely as memorable as either Brave New World or 1984. I don't know why I'm tossing it out there, because it's totally not germane to what we're talking about. But Aldous Huxley, he wrote satire. Both of these guys did reviews. They were, British men of letters, right? Orwell certainly did not really care much about having like a literary reputation as a great novelist. I think that he'd be much more interested in having a great reputation as a great journalist polemicist. And I think that he viewed both 84 and Animal Farm as polemics and not literature. Right. I think he might have been a little bit shocked to discover that he's being taught in high schools today. Right. Because he only died a couple of years after he published 1984. But for some reason, I keep thinking, when I think of Huxley, I keep thinking of Updike. And I don't quite know why. Because they never met. They never had any kind of interaction as far as I know. Right.
It's going to be hard proving a negative. I don't know. I've certainly never heard of them meeting. they could have. I mean, Huxley lived to 1963.
Yeah.
And Updike was active.
Yeah, and he was
in the
already a
years
name.
preceding.
Yeah, he was already a name of
Yeah.
that. Well, I don't know. For some, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think where they're overlapping, because we're ultimately we're talking about a creature that really doesn't exist anymore, which is the real professional writer. And I don't mean like a guy who just every year is going to produce a work of fiction. I'm talking about the one. It's like, I'm going to review books. I'm going to write my fiction. I'm going to write my poetry. I'm going to, have these other kind of art pieces and literary criticisms that I'm going to have. And it's like literally all I do is write all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And Orwell was definitely more of like the middle, lower class hack writer on that regard. Huxley was a little bit more established. And I think Updike was, again, more like Huxley in that regard. It's like a little bit more established and upper crust.
Yeah.
But, that's, I think, where they kind of overlap. But that entity doesn't exist anymore.
No.
In part, we specialize those writing skills to death.
Yeah.
And then, not to mention that the industry in and of itself isn't fruitful enough to get someone to do all of that anymore.
Yeah. There's not enough money. And quite frankly, a lot of people have realized that it's smart to just stick to what you know and shut up about everything else. Because look what's happened to Jonathan Franzen. I mean, forget about whether you think his novels are good or not. Whenever he does an essay, he gets shit on all over the place, right? People are lining up to shoot him down the second he pokes his head out and gives a non-novel piece of writing out into the world, right? So yeah, there's a clear sense that, you want to keep your head down and do just things that you're strongest at. There's also something else that I think is missing. See, both of these writers took a long time to develop, okay? In like Aldous Huxley, this was his fourth or fifth novel, Brave New World. He published it when he was 36, right? And 36, I believe. And George Orwell had he was near the end of his life. Well, he didn't know it at the time. He was 46, 47 when he published 1984. And he had published a whole truckload of stuff before that, okay? Nowadays, you will not have a writer who grows like that. Unless he's a minority. Unless he's one of the protected minorities. Like Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah. Yeah, but you won't have a genuine man of letters developing today because the marketplace doesn't exist for it anymore. I mean, if you wind up, writing something, you get stuck in ways. Or let me phrase it: the boundaries now between genres are impermeable. Before, you could be a literary critic who decided to write a novel. You could have a Graham Greene career of writing, reviews in order to pay the bills and working on your novel in the evenings and eventually publish it and start to grow your career like that. Now you can't. The literary world is much more closed off, and therefore, because of it, the kinds of books that get published are more specific,
Well, in a way, it's a manifestation of the assembly line world that Huxley depicted in Brave New World.
Yeah.
Which is to say, you don't really have the writerly way of life anymore. You're producing a certain kind of commodity that people will purchase or not.
Yes.
And thus, like everything else, you have your place on the assembly line, and you're going to do what the market expects of you.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. Because today the literary world is such that you're producing novels, but not just producing novels. You're producing young adult novels, or you're producing thrillers, or you're producing literary novels, quote unquote, which are their own genre. Which, of course, if they're their own genre, then by definition they're not literature. Now, are they? Everything is in its right place, like that great song by Radiohead. Everything in its right place, and because of that, the lack of permeability, it means there's no experimentation. It's just commodities. It's just being repeated, assembly line-like. Fucking depressing. I mean, it really is. Because, see, what's great about Brave New World to me is the fact that he started it as a parody, and it was supposed to be a parody satire. And it became something very different that that Aldous Huxley did not anticipate. In today's market environment in the literary world, this novel would not be published. It simply would not be published. They'd be like, what the fuck is this? Or worse, it would be published out like, oh, here's another dystopian novel. It's like its own genre, Everything is its own genre, and each genre has its certain tropes, its certain approaches to things, and you cannot break out of those tropes. You cannot break out of those boundaries. It's so fucking depressing for a writer, really. You can't break out. You have to toe the line, and there are lines all over the place. It's like that millimeter paper, that kind of engineering paper that STEM people use, and everybody is in their tiny little box, and nothing can break out of their box. It's fucking depressing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and so that's why I look at both of these novels, right? And I sort of like, I'm amazed that, I'm amazed that they were published, but then retrospectively I realized in the past there was more freedom to publish. And these genre-bending, groundbreaking novels would not be published today. The great novels that are being written today, if they are being written, they are not being published. Not by traditional publishers, not by the big five. Yeah, no. The great novels, the great literature, that's why we're not seeing it. It's not in your local bookstore, and it never will be. It's only just more forward products, Yeah, that's fucking depressing.
And to top it all off, I don't think we've hit it now, because I think people can read Huxley and Orwell and get the point of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I do give it a couple generations, and I can easily see the world that Aldous Huxley predicted was, you'll never have to worry about this book being a problem to any sort of engineered society, because we're going to reach a point where no one's going to read them. And even if they did read them, they weren't going to process how to resolve the situation that they're in. And I think this is a theme that I see common in a lot of the sort of early 20th century authors that I like, or let's say the first half of the 20th century. And maybe it's along the lines of what you had articulated, that like 100 years down the road, people are going to get what's kind of going on here. All of the authors I like understood almost inherently that the structuring and the engineering of society, the use of science as the liberating factor of man, was creating the new bounds of his the new chains of his world.
Yeah.
I think you see it in Huxley. Orwell, you get a little bit of it, but like we said, it's more like brute force kind of thing.
Yeah.
You see it, frankly, in a roundabout way in Lovecraft. I mean, as much as a guy who believed in science, it just, in his stories, it just opens up new paths of fear. And I think Huxley kind of, there's a quote here of Huxley. I forget where he said it, but I think it's a good summary of a lot of that point of view that I think a lot of the great literary and science fiction writers got at the time, which is science has explained nothing. The more we know, the more fantastic the world becomes, and the profounder the surrounding darkness. And that's above and beyond just like the epistemological knowing of things. It's also the very act of being scientific, the very act of structuring your world along these lines, just creates a profound sense of sadness in its articulation, in its action. As soon as you start living science, as soon as you start living, like I said, Taylorization, as soon as you start living, hey, we know scientifically how to resolve your pain. You're like, hey, it's just a bunch of chemicals that's going to get chemically treated. That's what's causing your sadness. The greater the profoundness of the darkness around you is. And I know that's a religious point of view that I have. I know that the liberalists in our world just cannot fundamentally comprehend that, because they're the skeptics. But the skeptics are just, these are guys perfectly designed for Aldous Huxley's world.
Yeah.
That's
soulless.
The soulless, consumers.
Yeah.
The entities that live. and nothing else.
Yeah, because there is something to be said when science can solve your problems, or can at least can diagnose them, uh, can diagnose all the problems, then your struggle, the struggles with whatsoever you might have, become trivial somehow. Trivial problems to be solved, and therefore your life becomes lesser. I mean, think of Dostoevsky. Think of the problems that he had with his gambling addiction, with his epilepsy, and all the rest of it, right? And how it influenced him, his life, his outlook, his religious belief, and how in turn that influenced his writing and the literature it brought forth because of it, right? Now, think of such a man and think of him today with the drugs, with Prozac, Xanax, whatever, Adderall, whatever is necessary to control his gambling addiction, whatever was necessary to control what was clearly a bit of hyperactivity on his part, and a bit of manic compulsiveness on his part. All those things that would have diminished him. He would not have written Crime and Punishment. He could not have been able to write Crime and Punishment because he wrote it when he was in a manic period, or a slightly manic period. But see, we don't even look at him as being manic at the time. We look at him as a great artist who, pulled himself together to write the thing because he needed the money, right? He needed the money to pay off his gambling debts. And, he pulled it off, and he delivered a great piece of writing, a great novel, something truly profound, especially in the end chapter. I mean, I've always thought that Crime and Punishment was a little bit baggy, to tell you the truth. But the ending is so powerful that it put paid to everything else. But the thing I'm trying to say here is that Dostoevsky would have been fixed by science and therefore diminished, and therefore we would not have gotten the literature that we got from him. And that's just a sad thought.
Well, that's the thing. The artifacts of the human society, the culture that we all, whether we like it or not, operate on, the notions of what it's like to be human, the notions of what it means to have a good life, the notions of what it means to have ethics. These are the products of things which exist beyond the material limits of the human. Right? So we don't, when we think about what it means to fall in love, for example, or what it means to have hatred for another human being, a lot of that is in some ways articulated through what Shakespeare wrote, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of it is articulated through the Dostoevsky's novels. A world operating under the assumption that the physical reality is just something to be stimulated and managed would rob you of the very artifacts which creates the human society that we live under. In other words, it is self-destructive, but it's also produces what I think Huxley captured accurately in Brave New World, which is the ephemeralness of everything. Like, the human species is precarious enough as it is. Mm-hmm. Not having any of the great manifestations of the mind to guide you, it makes it even worse.
Yeah.
And I think that's the world that's the Brave New World. And we're kind of there, I feel.
Yeah, I feel so too. Because let me ask you something parenthetically. Do you know of any, like truly great novel that has been published, in the last 10, 20 years? I mean, no fooling around. Like something truly great.
Well, here's the really sad truth. I'll be very truthful and say no,
Yeah.
But I'll also be even more truthful and say I couldn't tell you that I was looking for it.
Well, yeah, that's pretty bad. But I mean, if something great had come along, you would have known, right? I mean, you keep your ear to the literary ground enough that if something truly good had rolled around, you would have heard about it, right?
I would certainly have hoped that a book as great as, Brave New World or Crime and Punishment, if it had been produced, we would have heard of it. Yeah, I would hope that we're at least still able to do that.
Yeah, because I have to say that. Yeah, I have to say that I think that both Brave New World and 1984 are better, far and away better than anything that is being published today. I mean, I mean, it's far and away. I mean, head and shoulders. I mean, like, leagues ahead. Because really, the corrections, really, that's the best we can do, or fucking freedom, or what else? Something by, Jonathan Latham, Fortress of
Yeah.
Solitude, like based on a fucking Superman cartoon and shit. Oh God, come on, man! Don't tell me that's the best we can do. But apparently, that is the best we can do. Literature really seems to be dead.
Well, I think it was, who was it? It must have been Gore Vidal who said, or it was either Vidal or Norman Mailer, and I could be wrong on both of those counts. It said something to the effect of, "It's hard to expect literature in America to do that because at this point in time, we're not a culture that is moved by literature, nor frankly in, I think maybe of all of the Western cultures, maybe France is the closest that might be, but even then, I doubt it.
Mm.
Um, so the last book that kind of like was a shock, making a difference that that may be worthwhile is
Welbeck.
Submission,
Yeah.
Welbeck's Submission, and maybe a few others that he did. Um, so but that's the limits of that. I mean, we don't really live in a society that's moved by books. I mean, leave aside the whole notion of whether they're good or not.
Yeah.
When was the last time you saw a book be the center of attention in the general news media to say like, hey, this is a book that's made a profound impact on anyone? No, I mean, you at best will see some marketing in the Oprah's book club
Yeah.
kind of attitude. And that's just, housewives gathering together to fill time.
Yeah.
Sorry, Oprah, but that's all you are.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that the whole thing is just kind of tragic. That the art form is dead. It's dead. The corpse is being sold. I mean, it's been commercialized, but the art really is dead. And nobody's ever going to write novels like these two that we were discussing, and that is just profoundly depressing. Because I ultimately feel that literature is like the true embodiment of thought. Okay. Because like films, for instance, you can have interesting ideas and all the rest of it, but like the real deal is going to be literature. I truly feel that. I mean, you can disagree with me or not as the spirit moves you, but um, it's sort of like painting. That's another art form that has died. You know, that's kind of sad.
Well, I think, well, this is going maybe a little bit off point, but I think it's related. I think there seems to be an arc, a
Mm-hmm.
developmental arc that you can trace in painting and in literature. And literature is always about a few generations behind painting on this regard.
Yeah.
Um, you go from a period of painting for the sake of something, like your goal is to depict life in such a way, and
Mm-hmm.
the techniques are just hidden behind the scenes. Then you get into a period of recognizing the techniques itself, and the techniques become something you're talking about. This is where you get
Flaubert.
modernism
Flaubert. Right.
on display, and Flaubert and whatnot. So you appreciate the work of literature as literature. Then it becomes even more self-referential, and you notice the pitfalls and
Right.
the challenges of it. That's your postmodernism
Right.
right there. You can't take anything seriously. And once you're at that point, you then wonder, it's like, well, the jig is up and I can't take it seriously. And you wonder if it's going to maintain itself. I think painting went through that quicker than literature did,
Yeah.
but they both did.
Yeah.
And we're both kind of at the nadir point, at the aftermath of postmodernism. What next?
Yeah.
I think there is a potential, and I don't know how it would get done, to try to go back to the beginning and say, there is a purpose for literature, for painting to move people in the oldest traditionalist kind of way. And it could very well happen. I don't know how it might, but I see it like movements in literature to try and articulate that. I think it's like the new seriousness movement, which I think comes out of Russia, which was an attempt to just say no, that those older styles of taking it seriously, and
Mm-hmm.
in counterposition to irony,
Mm-hmm.
is kind of where people are trying to push it. But ultimately, I don't know what will succeed on that front. It feels like the culture as itself, rather than the culture trying to go back and get what it lost. I think the culture just moved on. it moved away from
Yeah,
those
yeah,
art
yeah. If you
pieces.
if you have to build a movement, the neo-serious, which actually sounds, I've never heard of it before. It sounds very interesting, but if you have to build a movement like that, then it's sort of pointless because it is a return, or no, it is reactionary. Okay, no, that's not what I'm trying to mean. It's nostalgic, trying to return to something that's gone. Nostalgia, nostalgia is a pit stop. It's not a destination. Okay, and so yeah, I don't see it. But then again, I think to myself that there are other art forms that are emerging, which I, for one, am very interested in. Like, for instance, in YouTube videos. I firmly believe that the YouTube video is a kind of art form. And the DIY aesthetic and being able to have the technological capability to make, little movies between, a few seconds long to half an hour or an hour even, I think that this is really remarkable because YouTube videos are artistically distinct from feature films. Feature films are a commercial enterprise, whereas YouTube videos are, pure expression. And because the person doing the one video, he's not aiming for commercial viability. He might be commercially viable, but it would be always in the aggregate. Because you need to have, for those of you who don't know, you need to have a lot of videos that garner a lot of views in order to make any kind of money. If you do the one video and cross your fingers and hope for it to be viral, you're going to get absolutely nowhere, right? And so my thinking is that the YouTube video is potentially a nascent art form, okay? Um, and you're starting to see some really interesting experimentation with it. But you're only beginning to see it. Experiments that might lead to something interesting, long-lasting, something, potentially fruitful. But of the dead arts, I would venture to say that um, painting, sculpting, poetry, and novels as an art form, I would say that they're dead. And that what we're seeing now is just its commercialization, the commercialization of the corpse. But as viable art forms, they're dead. And do you agree?
Yeah, I think feature films are getting there too.
Yes, and that's what I want to say. That's why Quentin Tarantino scares me so much because I think that he's a symptom of the decay of the art form, because he's all nostalgia and postmodernism, paying attention to the way he's doing something as opposed to what he's actually doing, especially in his last films, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, Jackie Brown seemed like an honest picture, but then after that, with the Kill Bill pictures, it was that postmodern stuff that signals decay. That sort of scares me. Yeah.
Well, I'll try to be hopeful then for the end of the podcast. I think the hopeful thing is to see the interesting things that people are doing on YouTube because it signifies a few things to me. One, that people are figuring out new creative outlets, but the very idea that one would want to do that means that a creative spark still exists in the hearts of man. And if the creative spark exists in the hearts of man, then man as a spiritual being still exists in some capacity, whether the people who do those kinds of, be it YouTube videos or new kind of art projects, what have you, whether they know it or not, they're acting as spiritual beings, which means that the hermit-like man in Brave New World, the book, the man who can't fit in the new society, in our world is not alone.
Mm.
There are many like him. And funny enough, despite all of the mechanisms of Google making YouTube a difficult place to operate, it's still functioning in that regard to get people to realize they are not alone,
Yeah.
which is part of the fucking exercise of creativity in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And so, yeah, let's leave the podcast on that hopeful note. And yeah, so this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed our program. I am Coach Redpill signing off for the show. Dr. Benway, do you have some final thoughts, final words, or are you just going to say so long and thanks for all the fish?
Why don't I encourage our audience in a way they see fit to open Aldous Huxley's doors of perception.
Yeah, I haven't read it, by the way. I'll get around to it. I'll try to get it on my list.
I intentionally leave that ambiguous. I don't know that I necessarily mean the book Doors of Perception. I simply mean the Doors of Perception.
Yeah, just trip out. Okay, that's a happy thought. Yeah, I can get behind that. Yeah. Trip away, audience members. So, this is Coach Red Pill signing off for Dr. Benway. Take it easy.
Later.